Hello, everybody in online U.S. history. Mr. Lujai here. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Richard Nixon, the president, and also his downfall with the Watergate scandal. So, we're going to take a few minutes to go over a little bit about who Richard Nixon was and why he's the only president to ever resign the presidency. So we're going to get started right away with this big question of what is dissent? So when I say dissent, you may think of a few different things, but if we classify what dissent in history usually means the expression or holding of opinions or actions that are different than those currently held. And we've talked about a lot of different ways that dissent has happened in American history, from the American Revolution, abolitionists prior to the Civil War, civil rights era leaders and figures, and everyday people that just went against the common knowledge or the ways that things were. Today, we're going to talk about dissent because two reporters are going to dissent against the President of the United States, changing the course of U.S. history. If you believe something to be true, absolutely pursue it. So, the specific example of dissent we're going to talk about today is the Watergate scandal that brought down President Richard Nixon. So, let's learn a little bit about Richard Nixon first. Richard Nixon was president from 1968 to 1974. So, we can see he didn't have a full 2 years in office. He's the only president in history to resign. And I'm not going to lie, my friends, Richard Nixon's one of the main reasons why I became so interested in history. As a young kid, I learned about his story, learned a little bit, and it just clicked with me. I was like, this guy is really, really interesting. He is a duality of a person, which I think is absolutely fascinating in history. He shows better angels as well as those inner demons that every single person has. And we can see him struggling with his moral compass throughout his entire life. Richard Nixon's going to actually lose the presidency in 1960 against John Kennedy. He's going to go on throughout the 60s to work as a conservative. In the 1950s, he was vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and finally he's elected in 1968. And here's a picture of our main man, Richard Milhous Nixon from California. So, what do you think of when I say Richard Nixon? If we were to ask the average American, they would say Nixon bad, Nixon resign, or they'd be like, who? And that's absolutely okay. That's why we're in history class right now. Nixon actually is one of the most influential presidents we've had. And if he didn't get embroiled with the scandal, as we'll find out, to try to win an election, probably would have gone down in one of our top 10 presidents we've ever had in our country. But unfortunately, his darker demons took advantage of his need to get people's approval. So while Nixon was president, he's going to do quite a bit. He is a Republican president, but he's actually quite moderate and liberal among a lot of standards today. We can see here Nixon, as a Republican conservative, believed that the federal government was too large. That is a key cornerstone of conservatism, a smaller federal government, more states' rights. He enacted the Southern strategy to try to appeal to former segregationists. So he's going to tilt the Republican Party down south. Today in 2023, the Republican Party has a stranglehold on a number of southern states that really begins during the Nixon presidency. And he also is going to have a firm stand against crime and drug use. He has a war on crime. He believes in a moral majority, the average straight and narrow American citizen that goes to work every day, has a family, lives in that white picket fence, obviously appealing to middle and upper class Republican suburban voters. On the other hand, though, he had an incredible amount of liberal or more democratic ideas. He's going to increase funding for programs such as food stamps. He increases Social Security payments. He believes that if you are an American citizen, you have a basic right to individuality and the ability not to starve to death. He took a special interest in environmental issues. In fact, I rank him as probably the number one environmental president. The EPA became a fixture while he was president, as well as just a number of other more environmental topics and ideas that corporations can't do anything. He created a new organization to prevent work-related injuries and deaths, and he's going to advance affirmative action. And so he's this duality of an individual. Nixon, though, is probably most remembered for his foreign policy. He's what we call a foreign policy president. When he was younger in the 1940s and early 1950s, he was a senator and he had incredible anti communist ideas. He's going to go after Americans who he believes are communists, sentences them to prison. In fact, in two cases, because of him, two Americans are put to death because he found out that they were Russian communist spies. And so his foreign policy credentials are really going to be around communism, but bringing the world closer together. He has the help of a man named Henry Kissinger, who actually just turned 100 this summer, a very controversial figure as well. Nixon's going to end the Vietnam War, but under cloudy circumstances. He prolongs the war in 1968 in order to get elected because it's easy to run for president and say, I'm going to end this war. But if it's ended before he's president, well, people aren't going to buy that argument. So he actually creates a fake plan to say, if you elect me, this is how I'm going to end the Vietnam War. It's going to rage for most of his presidency, but technically he does end the Vietnam War. He's also the first president to go to China. The phrase only Nixon could go to China comes from this. That means Nixon is so anti-communist. China is a communist nation that he's the only person that could go to China and not be considered a communist sympathizer, because for his entire life, he's hated communism, railed against communism, rallied against it. And so he is able to open up what now is one of the largest economies of the world, with one of the largest populations, and forges relationships with China that exist today. He's also going to strengthen relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We call that détente in history. Basically says, like, we know we're not going to kill each other. We know we're not going to launch our nuclear weapons against each other. So why don't we all just kind of take a step back for a second and maybe trade a little bit, talk to each other a little bit. Like, let's let out a collective sigh because we're not going to destroy the world. So all of these things Nixon has going for him. So what happens? Well, some people have a need. Oh, I totally forgot. While he was president as well in 1969, we land on the moon. The moon landing is the most watched event in the history of the world. It is the moment where almost every human being is united with this huge technological achievement. Yes, we did it. So what happened? How is his name synonymous with resignation and disgrace? Well, Nixon has a need to get people to like him. You don't go into politics if you don't want people to like you. And he barely wins the presidency in 1968. And he wants to make sure that he wins in 1972 when he's up for reelection. So he wants to make sure, I want to be a winner. So what he does is he himself doesn't do this, but people that work for him, his aides, his closest advisors and friends, orchestrate this at the beginning without Nixon's knowledge. But they hire some shady criminals to break into George McGovern and the Democratic National Committee's reelection office. This office is located at the Watergate Hotel. This is going to have the Democrats' plan on how to beat Nixon in 1972, their strategy, where they're going to spend money, what they think their weaknesses are. And so Nixon's aides hire a group of criminals called the Plumbers to go in and break in and steal the information. These criminals, though, are arrested at the Watergate Hotel on their way out in a massive cover-up that eventually will end in a presidential resignation begins. So initially, though, here's a picture of the Watergate Hotel. It's in Washington, D.C. You can still go to the Watergate today. It's there. You can stay there. You can tour it. Huge hotel in our nation's capital. So initially, the break-in's going to be forgotten. It was like, if you ever read the newspaper or, kids, Instagram, who knows how that works, but it's not very popular at the moment. Like, yes, and 4 criminals were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. Next article, people forgot very quickly. Richard Nixon's going to go on to win that re-election by the largest electoral majority in history. He's very happy. He's confident. He's won 4 more years. The people love him. But there's 2 individuals, people by the name of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They're reporters for the Washington Post. They read this article about the break-in and they thought something's off about this. Something's odd. They didn't quite believe the story of what was being told to them. especially when they found out that one of the people arrested worked for the re-election campaign of Richard Nixon. They thought that was odd. Why is this person that works for Nixon breaking into their opponent's campaign office? And so they do what journalists do best and what citizens do best. They ask questions. They start interviewing people. They try to get to the bottom of what is going on. And eventually, more and more of this story starts to unravel. And it turns out there is more information there. This is a picture of Woodward and Bernstein in the Washington Post office in 1972-73, digging into these stories. So they keep digging in. Even when the president of the United States, Richard Nixon, says, like, this has nothing to do with me. These two reporters are grasping for straws. There's nothing there. Nixon uses the entire power of the executive branch to try to make this story go away. But these two reporters will not stop. They go deeper and deeper, interviewing more and more people. Eventually, they begin to understand, like, this is a cover-up. The White House knew that these individuals were going to break into the Watergate Hotel. So he begins to scramble. He covers up the crime so no one's going to know what happened. He's going to make his staffers take the blame. He makes his staffers lie under oath. They pay off witnesses with funds from the re-election campaign. A special prosecutor is named to investigate this, and Nixon fires the attorney general, who refuses to fire the special prosecutor, fires the assistant attorney general to try and stop the investigation. Finally, he finds a man that's going to fire the special prosecutor. But by that point, so much of this thread is starting to unravel. The American people are taking notice. And every night the story is, here's an update on Watergate. Here's an update on Watergate. Here's an update on Watergate. So the end game here, my friends, it's the Washington Post, Bernstein and Woodward versus the President of the United States. Now, prior to 2023, we have to kind of go back a few years, but most Americans, in fact, almost all Americans, believed in the integrity of elected officials. That's kind of unraveled recently. People believed the president. Richard Nixon went on camera and he said, I had nothing to do with this. And the American people said, why would the president lie? He's the president, for gosh sakes. He's not supposed to lie. Today, people don't believe anything. You know, you say the sky's blue and they say red. And so the amount of trust people put in the presidency was much higher. People believed him. But finally, one of Nixon's top aides turns against him. Guy has a little bit of a moral compass, Howard Dean, who's also going to go to prison for covering up. So he cuts a deal and he says, I'll tell you the truth. And he proceeds to give the Washington Post, Bernstein and Woodward enough evidence to prove that Nixon knew of the crime. He knew that his people were involved in the Watergate break-in, and then he knew about all of the hush money, all of the other illegal activities to try to get this story removed from the press. In the most damning piece of evidence, it's revealed that Richard Nixon recorded all of his conversations. He had little microphone bugs put into his Oval Office, on his phone, in his residence, so that he could record every conversation he had with people. As he said, so that history will know exactly what I was thinking, because he thought he was going to go down as the greatest American president. But on these tapes, he's talking about the crimes. He's talking about the cover-up. The president in the Oval Office is directing his staff, make this Watergate story go away. And eventually, when those tapes are turned over to the public after a Supreme Court fight, the American people lose faith in their president. And so, facing impeachment, Nixon decides to resign. So two reporters who believed that there was something more going on in this story brought down an American president who was a liar, who covered up crimes, who went against his oath of office. And Nixon becomes the only president to ever resign. Now, in a fun little factoid in history, Nixon's original vice president, a man by the name of Spiro Agnew, also turned out to be a criminal, but for a completely different thing. He was taking bribes from public officials, and he'd say, like, you want me to build a bridge in Massachusetts? Bring me $10,000 and I'll make sure it happens. That's against the law. So Spiro Agnew was forced to resign a few months before Richard Nixon was. Nixon names a replacement for the vice president, a man by the name of Gerald Ford, who, when Nixon resigns, becomes president. Gerald Ford's the only man never to be elected to the office of either vice president or president to then serve as president of the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about Ford's pardon in just a second, but Gerald Ford, the man that took over after Richard Nixon resigns, decides to pardon Nixon of any and all crimes he may have committed. This goes down as one of the most controversial choices in American history, and in fact, cost Gerald Ford his own actual election to the presidency because he runs as the incumbent president in 1976. But Ford said it was the right thing to do. The American people had to move on. And I, as president, thought it was the best idea to move the American people on from Watergate. So today, when you think of Nixon or Watergate, most people think of government corruption. This is going to be the start of Americans questioning politicians, of Americans not listening blindly to the president of the United States. And a healthy amount of skepticism and dissent is important for a high functioning society to work. So this has been amazing. I love this topic. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And as always, have a great day.